My name is Mike McShane. I'm a graduate student here in the Department of Education Reform, and it is my distinct pleasure to get to introduce our guest speaker today. Thank you for coming too. This is our last Friday lecture of the semester. They're going to get fired back up in January. January is the next one. You can always go to uaedreform.org to see the schedule of upcoming events. We've got some totally awesome people coming in the spring, and you should definitely check it out. But speaking of totally awesome people, we have Dr. Elizabeth Dhuey here, who is currently, I want to get this right, an assistant professor in the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at the University of Toronto, where she's also in the Department of Management at the University of Toronto. Before that, she was a research associate at the Public Policy Institute of California in San Francisco. Before that, she got her PhD in economics at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Primarily, she does research in many interesting areas in grade configurations, so organizing schools into middle schools, junior highs, and the effect it has on student achievement. She's doing some work now also on the effect of principals. But today, we're going to hear about school entry policies that affect academic and labor market outcomes. And I would like to say, just as one last bit, that Dr. Dhuey did win the 2011 Postdoctoral New Scholars Award from the Association of Education, Finance, and Policy, of which many of us are members. So we're clearly very excited to have her here, excited to hear your talk. So, Dr. Elizabeth Dhuey.
What an introduction. Thank you so much for having me. This is a little cool that the thing stops right here. If I fall off the side, has anybody fallen off the side yet?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, I'll be the first person. Okay. So thanks again for coming to see me. It's been very exciting to be in Arkansas. I have not been here before, so it was nice to see a very small part of the state for a very short amount of time. But I'm going to sort of be talking about sort of this research agenda I've been working on for about 5 years, starting with my first paper was part of my dissertation, looking at these school entry policies and how they affect children early on and then later on. So I'm just going to sort of whiz through what I've discovered over the last 5 years, sort of about what I'm going to call age effects, and we'll talk about it in detail. And then I'm going to sort of slow down and talk about how moving the cutoff date changes kids' outcomes. Okay? So it's going to be sort of a mishmash. You guys told me to talk about whatever I wanted, so I'm talking about whatever I want. So I'm going to give you sort of an overview at the beginning and then a lot more details at the end. Anybody have questions? I don't know how we do it here, but if you want to ask questions, I'm happy to take them if I'm not being clear or whatnot. Okay, so the motivation behind this whole research agenda was the fact that I started to get older and all my friends were having kids, and everybody started talking about cutoff dates and, oh no, your kid was born in January, they're going to have problems. Oh, your kid, oh good for you, your kid's in August, they're going to be fine, right, when they enter school. And so there's all this discussion about it. And I wanted to know, well, does it really matter, right? So my little picture here is about redshirting, the idea of keeping your kindergartner out for a year. And the idea of redshirting came from sports, where in college, you had the 18-year-old boy playing football, he wasn't big enough. She kept him out for a year and gave him a red shirt, literally, back in the day. And then a year later, when they're 19, they're bigger, buffer, and we're better football players or hockey players. From Canada, it's all about hockey. And this is showing this little kid. He's red-shirted, and so he's bigger and better, and he's going to do better in school. Okay? So the motivation is just sort of looking at this. We have all this folklore about age, and does it matter? So it is true that we're having a graying of kindergarten. So our kindergartners are getting older. And there's two reasons. We have increase of redshirting, I'm going to talk about that in detail, and we're also moving our minimum age school entry laws earlier into the school year. Okay? So again, when I'm talking about redshirting, I'm talking about the idea of your kid's ready to go to school, there's a specific cutoff date for where they're supposed to enter school, and as a parent you say, you know what, my kid's not ready. Or the preschool teacher says, little Johnny's not doing so well, you should keep him back a year. So it's delaying entry into school. And it's often referred to as the gift of time. And this idea is, if you keep your child out for a year, they're going to do so much better. If they're relatively young, they're going to mature a year, and then they're going to do so much better later on. Boys are much more commonly redshirted than girls. So little boys have a lot more maturity issues earlier on. Maturity, maybe all the time, I don't know. And so they're more commonly redshirted. And children from socioeconomically advantaged families are more likely to redshirt because it costs something to redshirt, right? If you send your kid to school, it's essentially free childcare, where if you keep them out an extra year, you actually have to pay for additional year of childcare. And there's also costs of, somebody mentioned at dinner, I think last night, the cost of keeping your kid at home is a cost also, depending how you feel about it. So we're going to talk a little bit about redshirting and sort of looking at, is this idea of age, does it really matter? And how, in what avenues does it matter? And then I'm going to talk about the fact that the minimum school entry age laws have been changing significantly in the U.S. So I'm actually from Canada, but this is all about U.S. data and U.S. stuff. So policymakers have been moving the school entry age cutoff date earlier and earlier in the school year, making children older at school entry. So it's opposite of what people think. So you go earlier in the year, you get older kids. So it's been a big thing. Almost all states have moved their cutoffs. We'll look at the data in a little while. But basically, a lot of the rhetoric is about, it's better for the children. And then you start looking at the actual legislation documents, and it's all about improving NAEP scores. Because what happens is you get this nice costless way, almost costless way, of getting a 1-year bump in your test scores. Because all of a sudden, you change your cutoff date, and then 1 year, you have a cohort that's older and they do better on the NAEP scores. And all of a sudden you go, oh, we're doing so fabulous, we have improvement on our test scores. California just did that. A lot of discussion in California secretively was about, we're going to make California look better because we're going to increase our scores by doing that. So they went from December 2nd to October 1st. It also is cost savings. For one cohort, they have a smaller cohort, right? So if you change the cutoff date from January 1st to October 1st, your incoming cohort is actually going to be a fourth smaller, 25% smaller. And so in California, as in the huge budget crunch they had, this was really important because for 13 years, they're going to have a smaller cohort going through school. So there's all sorts of reasons why these cutoff dates are changing. And I was sort of skeptical and saying, well, there's a lot of words about how great it is, but nobody has actually looked about, is this good or bad for the children? Who cares about NAEP scores, right? Well, people do, but is it actually beneficial long term? So I just want to first look at the idea of, how long do I have, by the way? There's no clock up here. I have my clock. I get an hour?
Yeah.
Okay. So first we'll look at, does it matter if you're relatively old in your class versus relatively young? So most states, Arkansas I think is a little different where they didn't have one particular cutoff date, but it has sort of a range of dates. Most states actually have a specific date. September 1st, you have to be 5 years old by September 1st to enter into school. I think now we have one here, right, in August. And so what happens is that creates a continuum of ages in one cohort. So kindergarten, kids are going to be up to 20% older than the youngest kids. And when you're talking about 4.5 and 5 and 5.5-year-olds, it makes a really big difference in terms of maturity levels. Maybe the year has knows 4.5-year-old versus a 5.5-year-old. It's a huge difference. Okay? But the question is, do these initial maturity differences that we see early on, and they go into school, they're in the spring class, do they have long-run effects? Because it doesn't really matter, I suppose, it matters for the kindergarten teacher and the first grade teacher if there's these maturity differences. But for the policymakers, so I'm going to fall off the edge, if they're just maturity differences and they dissipate over time, we might not be worried about it. So what I did was I started looking at test scores. That's the first place you go for data, is looking to see if there's test score effects. Looking at educational attainment, and then we're going to give you the punchline is it does matter if you're old. You get a benefit for being old. And then I said, well, what other avenues to get a benefit for being old or a disbenefit from being young? And I looked at leadership and special education. So the first paper, so this is actually work that's been done with a variety of co-authors. So I'm not taking full credit for this. This is work done by Kelly Bernard at UC Santa Barbara. And we decided to say, okay, are there long-term effects in terms of being the relatively oldest kid in the class versus the relatively youngest kid in the class? Okay? And we wanted to say, are there effects that are perpetuating? So like we don't care, the original research that Ashleisha Datar looked at, she looked at kindergarten and first graders, and she found an effect. And I was like, well, of course there's an effect for kindergartners and first graders, but I want to say, is there an effect that lasts longer? You know, does it matter if I have a young kid, should I be putting them in or not? And so we used Tim's data and looked across lots of developed countries, and what was sort of shocking was we found these relative age effects, meaning the older kids are better than younger kids, in a wide variety of different developed countries. And it's a big effect, 2 to 9 percentiles at 8th grade. So these are when kids are 15. You can't imagine that a 14-and-a-half-year-old and a 15-year-old is much different from each other in maturity. Maybe some people are arguing for that, but less of a difference. And we're seeing these really, really large effects. These countries also have really different educational systems, right? They all have one single commonality. Well, they have probably other commonalities, but one single commonality is that they have a specific cutoff date once in a year. Okay, so we get these continuum of ages. Interestingly enough, the only country that we don't see a large effect is Denmark. And they start their kids in curriculum very late. So they start at 7. Okay, so they're the few countries that we don't see these age effects are countries that kids may be in school, but they don't actually start curriculum learning kind of stuff that we think of in school until later. So Denmark and Finland are on the low end, and we don't see much of age effects. But we see a huge amount, and we were shocked by this. You know, all the way from, we have, you know, Japan has really large effects, the US, England, Denmark, Belgium, Austria, we're seeing effects everywhere. So then we're saying, well, that's sort of cool. We were shocked by, you know, my co-author is from Canada also, and so there's a lot of talk about hockey. And hockey is really important to be big, so there's all sorts of jockeying about, and people try to plan births in Canada around the hockey leagues. Honest to God, it's amazing. And so we thought, you know, okay, we'll see a little thing, but to see such large effects in 8th grade was sort of shocking. So we're like, yeah.
Just before you go on, do these have any implications for other studies of international comparisons? I mean, would we, for example, see that kids in one nation or versus another tend to be slightly older because of different cutoff dates, and therefore you might see a 5 percentile difference
So
in that country versus this country?
So they're mostly starting around the same time, minus Denmark and Finland, but we're looking within a cohort, we're looking within the cohort.
Okay.
So we're not looking, so they're, at this time, they're all the same age, 15 to 14.
Right, I guess I'm just wondering if that has further implications for cross-country comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it might be, I don't know, if it's worth looking at.
Yeah.
And birthday gaming is actually a common phenomenon or non-trivial phenomenon. It might affect also the use of birth date as an exogenous.
Okay, yeah, so we did a lot of work. There's 2 countries in Europe that have Turkey, and it was Turkey, and this is a while ago. Turkey was one of them where people actually do, like when you look at the distribution, we spent a lot of time looking at the distribution of births and birth effects. And Turkey was one that there was pretty obvious birth gaming or birth certificate gaming, where there was way too many people born in certain months, and so we didn't use those. There is a little bit of effect in the U.S. We can look at natality data in the U.S. with the best data, and we can find that more educated, higher income families generally have kids in the summer. So they have a little bit of bump. There was a paper out of Notre Dame recently, I think it was looking at that they showed that people do time, women who are of higher income levels generally have their kids in the summertime. That's going to bias our results downwards because our cutoff states in the fall, so these are the young kids. So we're going to have a better, higher income people are actually on the lower end.
So I'm not familiar with the TIMS data. I didn't realize. So this is micro level TIMS data that has a date of birth.
Yes, it does.
Wow.
Month of birth. Yeah, it's one of the few databases. PISA actually does too. Not all waves, PISA. Yeah.
Does this in any way take into account the number of years in preschool or kindergarten?
No, we don't have that
That
information.
would vary
It does vary.
considerably,
Yeah.
and my class, I would be
Yes.
by those
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. We don't have a lot of that information. you're going to see that we have sort of a black box at the moment. I'll tell you what we know that's sort of on the periphery of this box, and then we need to go sort of into it a little bit more. This is just sort of the first cut at this. We also decided to look, say, like we said, 15-year-olds, that's pretty impressive. We're seeing these effects long term. So we looked in Canada and the US. In British Columbia, we found that the oldest students are about 13% more likely to be university bound. In British Columbia, they have very strict guidelines of what classes you need to take to go to university. And you take these classes to go to university, these classes to go to vocation. So we looked at the kids that were in this university track, about 13% more likely. In the US, we used NELS and was able to find that the oldest child was about 8% more likely to take the SAT or ACT, and then more likely to go on to a 4-year accredited university. So we're seeing these long-term effects. Then I sort of, after writing that paper, I was like, this is sort of interesting. Like, why is this happening? I can tell a lot of stories about, well, you know, it's ability grouping, it's X, it's Y, everybody has their own personal story, but we don't really know why these initial maturity differences perpetuate over time. Yeah?
For clarification, where would kids who are held back end up in this? Are they older kids, or do they get excluded since they've been held back?
They're getting excluded. Yeah. So we're using an instrumental variable strategy. So actually, interestingly enough, I can't tell you. I've done a lot of research on this. I still can't exactly tell you whether or not holding your young kid back is beneficial. You gotta love these caveats, right? So I can tell you that within a cohort, being young is bad, but I can't. We don't have an estimation strategy where I can get at, you know, if you hold your kid back, are they better off later on? I actually don't know that.
You got to hold it back early or never, or you don't know.
I don't know.
But you know if holding them back early.
We know that being young is bad. That's what we know. So then I started saying, well, what's going into this? And so there's a really interesting database called Project Talent that nobody uses. It has lots of interesting, it's microdata again, and it has a lot of information about leadership. So whether or not you're a sports team captain, whether or not you're a club president in high school. And so we started saying, well, you know, let's see if, because one of these avenues you could think of is that these kids, you know, get more responsibility because they're more mature and they're the class monitor, the board wiper. That was the one I really liked doing, was wiping off the board. You know, and the next year you've done that, so you get the best, another job, and then so on and so forth. And so we looked at this Project Talent, also high school and beyond, and NILS again. And we basically found that being relatively old made you more likely to be a high school class president, or a club president, sorry, not class president, or a varsity sports club leader, right? So you have this leadership effect going on. Relatively older students acquire more leadership experience before graduating than their classmates. So they're more likely to be a leader, and they also get more leadership experience. And then it was positive related to self-assessed leadership. These kids were saying that they're, you know, have more confidence, they're more mature, they have higher on all these scales, which I thought was sort of interesting. So I was sort of getting in the black box a little bit, but not, again, there's a big box to get into. I turned to special education. So when you talk to kids, teachers, they talk about behavioral difficulties of little boys, you know, the young little boys in school. And I said, well, this is interesting. I wonder if these kids are more likely to be diagnosed as special ed. They shouldn't, right? Because in all documentation about whether or not kids should be in special ed, it always says relative to age. You're going to say, look at their skills, looking at their mental capacity relative to age. It's explicit. We looked at all sorts of documentation. Clearly, this is not being taken into account. So young boys, especially, are more likely to be referred to being in special ed. Okay? And not surprisingly, when we do this, we don't see any kind of relative age effect into orthopedic impairments or brain injuries, that kind of stuff. We see it all in the learning disability and mental retardation categories, the more soft skill, there's soft categories. So other people, we're not the only people, like I'm not the only person that's been working on this, sort of a huge new literature. And other people have looked at other achievement test scores. So I think Tara was one of the first. She's at Rand, and she looked at early test scores and found that the older kid is more likely to have higher test scores. Other people have looked, Alderman Lotsky, Connie Weber, in a variety of different contexts and different data sets. And what's amazing about this is you find it everywhere you look. So no matter what the data is, and you have a birth date information in it, you will find some sort of relative age effect. Now, the tricky part, though, is we found some long-term education effects, but we weren't able to look at wages because it's hard to find wage data with birth dates because you need cutoff information and you need birth date information. A couple people have tried to look at wages, and this is something that's not as clear-cut of what's going on. So some people have found positive effects on wages, other people have found no effect. So that's sort of an open question. And the problem, it gets really messy because when you're old, you hit the compulsory schooling leaving law quicker. So you're more likely to drop out because you get older quicker. But then on average, older kids are dropping out more, and on average they're doing better. So you have sort of like one effect going up, one going down, and so it's really hard to disentangle that. If anybody could actually, it's a good research agenda for anybody to try to figure out how to get at that carefully. But right now it's sort of unknown what's going on. So overall, I think it was really fascinating to me that we found these strong effects. This is one of these projects when I started out early in my career, I was showing it to people and they're like, you will never have a project again in your life that is so clear cut. You see it everywhere, that everything's significant no matter what I do to the data, it's significant. And so you're seeing, and so what we find, is that these you get a benefit from being relatively old. So that brought me into this idea of, well, if age matters, what other ways does this matter? Because right now I have what I just talked about was very narrow in the sense that, like, within a cohort, I know that if you're old, you do better than, on average, than your youngest classmate. I told someone at dinner that nobody here, I'm shocked at you guys, normally somebody is like, raises their hand very patiently and says, well, I was the youngest person in the class, and I did really well. Yes, I know, you're fine, don't worry, it's okay. So it's on average, the youngest kids have it's a disservice. Again, we don't know, should we keep our kids out? I don't know that. We don't know that we don't know a lot of stuff about it. My co-author that did all the international work with me, her kid was young and she put him in on time, but she made sure that the school that her child was going to had no testing, no ability grouping, and was very very careful of what kind of school to send her relatively youngest kid to. So, but we don't really know. But clearly policymakers think they know something about age. Okay? So they're changing these cutoff dates over and over again. There's lots of changing these cutoff dates. So let's just look at a number of states. 1964, what happened, well, before there's actual, I don't have it on here, but generally most schools or states had a cutoff date of around January 1st, back in the early 1900s. By 1964, we still have a huge weight of states, these are all state level, that have a January, February, December cutoff date. We have local education authority. That means that it's not done at the state level, it's done at some sort of local district level. I think Arkansas is actually in there most of the time as a LEA. And then there's actually some that have none during this time period. And then you can see this shift over time where in 1988, all of a sudden we have a lot more September start school year, which generally means September or middle August kind of start dates. And even now, more and more. Okay? So my skeptical side of me says it's all about test scores comparatively. But if you're going to step back from that, you might say, well, policymakers think they're doing something that's beneficial. Which is opposite of what most people think, because we're thinking more school is better earlier, more sooner now. And so, which is sort of odd, because now we're moving this cutoff date earlier in the year, which is making older kids. So we wanted to look and say, well, what kind of benefit does this policy have? Okay. So when you have these cutoff dates, states with a later cutoff date have earlier entries. always opposite of what people want to think. So it's later dates. January has younger kids. January cutoff is younger kids than a September cutoff. Okay? And so if you have a later cutoff, you get to go to school earlier, right? And so you start learning school skills. Hopefully we're teaching these kids something in school. So you're learning those skills early in your life. But then you also have more kids that are not ready for school. Okay? And so those not ready for school kids might have direct impacts on them. So if I go to school and I'm early and I'm young and I'm not ready to learn, I don't learn very well. But I can also have indirect effects on all of you guys because I'm going to be noisy and loud and be chaotic. And that's what you talk about kindergarten pictures, or like the one little boy Johnny is just, can't keep him in line, right? So he's going to have, or me, it's going to have really large impacts on you. And you can also shape the curriculum, right? Because I'm not ready to learn, so you got to do something else to include everybody, okay? So, but when you change these age effects, so the cutoff dates, 3 things are going on. So we just talked about relative age effects, and that's the idea of kids in one cohort being older than younger. But there's also 2 other effects when we're changing this policy that we got to think about carefully. And there's also 2 different groups of children you got to think about, okay? So follow me and then it'll get a little bit clearer. So let's have an example where we have a January 1st cutoff date and we switch it to October 1st. Okay? So the directly affected children are the children who are born in that 4th quarter, right? The cutoff date changed, their entry into school has changed. They're directly affected by that policy. The other kids, the babies in the 1st quarter, 2nd quarter, and 3rd quarter, they're indirectly affected by it. They're in the state that this policy changed, but the cutoff didn't make a difference in when they actually entered school. So we're going to have something where we call an absolute age effect, and that's for just the directly affected children. So these are the kids, when I say absolute age, I mean like biological age, in the sense that the cutoff date changes 3 months. I used to be able to go in this year, and now I got to wait a whole extra year. So those directly affected children are going to be a year older when they enter school. So they're going to be biologically older. The cohort age also changes, because now you take a quarter of these kids, make them a year older, the whole cohort is older, right? And the older cohort is going to affect me as the person that's affected by the cutoff date, and it's going to affect you guys because I'm going to maybe be less disruptive, or learn better, or whatever other mechanism. And then you have what we were already talking about is these relative age effects. And so now the kids that were relatively old are relatively young. Some that are relatively young become relatively old. But on average, it washes out because we still have a 12-month span of age. Okay? So when we first started this project, I was like, oh, I'm going to be brilliant. I'm going to we have all this stuff about relative age effects, and I'm going to tell you what happens in biological age. We change the cutoff dates, they're older, and I'm going to tell you what happens to entering old. And then we started thinking about it, and it's like, actually, this is a lot more confusing and complicated because you have all these interacting effects going on, and empirically, we have to look at what's going on. We don't know. So you imagine that the absolute age effect is probably positive. Probably, maybe, but empirically we don't, we have to test it. The cohort age effect, teachers generally say that that's going to be a positive thing. And then the relative age effect, you have some people having a negative hit. We know that empirically. If you go from old to young, that's bad. For young to old, that's good. But overall, we don't really know what's going to go on. So what did we do to look at this? So we took all the cutoff dates. So we went back and we researched all the cutoff dates in the U.S. from 1964 to about 1980. Painful. If anybody needs them, I have them, and I would rather share them than anybody go through that again, because it's very painful. And so we took these cutoff dates, and we only took the states that we had, the LEA states and the none states. We have to drop out our sample, because I can't go and look at district level data. I guess I could, but I'm not going to. So we took the ones that had a strict cutoff date, not a range, just saying you have to enter by September 1st. And we translated this cutoff date into the minimum entry age. So January 1st, the youngest child is going to be 56 months old. September 1st is going to be 60 months old, right? So we just translate this cutoff date into this minimum school entry age. is a little bit shorter of a talk. I'm not going to go into all the details of the short run effects because it would take us an hour and a half to get through everything. But basically what we first wanted to check out is saying, okay, do people, first off, is there compliance to these entry age laws? So we've been talking about redshirting, and the idea of redshirting is that you're actually not being compliant, right? There is a cutoff date, and you go and say, you know what, my kid is not ready. I'm going to petition the school district, or I'm going to talk to the principal, or there's a variety of ways to do it, and so I'm not going to put my kid in on time. So people can be non-compliant to these cutoff dates. So what we wanted to make sure was, when these states are moving these cutoff dates, and they're generally moving them from later in the year to earlier in the year. There's two examples where they switch back. Indiana's been sort of schizophrenic on this, where they go back and forth over and over again. I don't know what they're doing. But generally they're going from January or the year. And we want to say, is there compliance to this? And we look at data, we look at the census data, 1960, 70, 80 census, and we find that there is compliance, and people actually are responding, which is not surprising because the majority of us law-abiding citizens see a cutoff date, you go, okay, I'm going to send my kid in. So we find non-perfect compliance, but it's in the same rate that other papers and other people have looked at this have found. Then we say, okay, well, maybe it's going to affect educational attainment. So maybe, entering in school later is going to affect your total educational attainment. And so we look at educational attainment using the census, and I'll talk about the data in a lot more detail in a second. And we actually, interestingly, find no effect on educational attainment. So moving these cutoff dates has no effect on high school graduation rates or going to college or university. What we really looked at, because what economists like to look at is wages, right? Really, the fundamental thing is we always want a wage equation. And I had done 5 years of work and hadn't had a wage equation yet. And so I was like, we're going to look at wages. And those are the long run, as long run as I can think of effect, right? So I want to say, does this have an effect? We see nothing on education. Does this have an effect on wages? Is this good or bad for the kids? So we look at 1959 to 1981 U.S.-born cohorts. So you have to have been born in the U.S. We use the 2000 U.S. Census, the 5% sample. And we also use an ACS, the American Community Survey, which is sort of the replacement long-form census. And so that gives us 20 cutoff changes to work with. Ideally, this is a paper that you want to write in like 10 to 15 years from now, because all the states have been doing lots of changing in like late 80s, early 90s to now. And clearly you can't look at long-run effects with such a recent data. So this is something that when you're all old and professor-like, the grad students, and you have a student say, that's a good paper to replicate now, right? Because it would be really interesting to see, because now we have even more variation in these cutoff dates. So we're going to look at 24 to 47-year-olds who reside in 44 states. The other states that we're missing are the ones that are LEA or they don't have a cutoff date. The first thing that pops out, especially if you've been trained in economics, is, wow, you're using really young people for wages. And the reason why we have to do that is just data limitations, because we can't go back too far because they weren't changing their cutoff dates back. So we have this range, and so we have to look at younger individuals, and you normally want to for looking at wage outcomes. If you look at the paper, I think there's a new, I think you guys have a version, but there's a much more recent paper on my website if anybody's ever interested. We do, 1 million robustness and sensitivity checks, so it's all covered. So we do look at older age frames, and it doesn't make much of a difference in terms of magnitude. It just makes it a little bit noisier. We also want, because we're using younger people, we want to make sure that they're not still in school. So I know I was in school after 25. We don't want those people, right? We want to look at your wages in the working world. So we look at people who are not enrolled in school. We don't want to look at people in prison. We, again, want to look at people who are actually attached to the labor market so that their wages actually mean something. So we restrict our sample to people who report positive earnings. So you've got to have some income. You got to report positive weeks of work. So you got to have at least worked, something, and positive usual hours of work. So you got to be somewhat attached to the labor market. Okay? So our basic empirical strategy is really sort of a straightforward state of birth panel. where we have the census and we regress the log hourly wage for individual I born in state B observed in year T and census Y. Okay? I'm looking at my code notation there, right? So we have individual I, they're born in a particular state. We control for their age and what census they're in, so their cohort. We regress this on this minimum school entry age. This is what I showed you in the last couple slides ago, where it's, if you're September 1st, that's 60 months, right? And so on and so forth. So our coefficient of interest is that alpha 1. That's saying, if we change this minimum school entry age by 1 month, how does that affect your wages? We control for your current age, right? Because we have a variety from 25 to 47-year-olds. State of birth, where you're born, and the year of birth. So we have fixed effects for all that. And I'll tell you, we have to do other specifications to do some robustness. So again, it's sort of a straightforward thing. And again, it's sort of a net policy effect. We're just saying, okay, we change this entry age, how does that change long-term wages or later wages? Okay, this is my one messy table for you guys. So let's just focus on the top number. All these numbers on this table are all alpha 1s from different regressions. Panel A is males. We want to focus on males. Our referees made us go back and do females, but females are really messy during this time period. There's a lot of changes in female labor supply during this time period. And we're also looking at like prime childbearing ages of women. So it's really, we have it all on our paper, so you can look at what happens to women, but it's really sort of, what does this mean? I'm not sure. So I'm going to show it to you. I didn't want to mess up our tables too much. The women, if you looked at women who are firmly in the labor supply, meaning they were working full time, women and men are the same. We find the same effects. But if you're just looking at all women, they're a little bit fuzzy. So column 1 is just that alpha 1 that I just showed you, right? So it's saying we move the cutoff date 1 month earlier, wages increase by 0.6% for each month. Some people think that's big, some people think it's small. The average change is about 3 months. So most states on average is a 3-month change. So, it's 0.6 times 3. Now we add other educational variables. So we have a slew of things that you might think might be correlated with this change in cutoff date. You might be worried it's bundled with other factors like expenditures on education, introduction of subsidized kindergarten, all sorts of things. We control for as much as we humanly can. And what we find is the point estimate really doesn't change. When I did a legislative review of all 50 states, I did it myself, so I can say that there was never any evidence it was bundled with anything else to go through this. There was never much evidence. I never saw any evidence, actually, that was bundled with anything else. But it could be, but the observables that we have doesn't make a difference. Then you might be worried about, well, maybe it has something to do with where people migrate to, because right now we're just controlling for state of birth. But clearly when you're an adult, a lot of us don't live where we were born, right? So we can control for the educational outcomes, the state of residence, and then we can also include a time trend for where you're living, so cohort, state of residence, time trend. We also include the state of residence unemployment rate and GDP, say maybe that just has something to do with where people are sorting into the US. And you see that it doesn't actually make much of a difference. We finally, on column 4, we do the more checks, where we're saying, well, maybe people are even more selective into from where they're born to where they move. So there's a lot of literature about migration. And so if we can control a region of birth times region of residence, dummies, we control that, it doesn't really change. Finally, if you want to be really a stickler, you can say, well, let's put in linear state of birth specific cohort trends. That's a new favorite thing in all kinds of panels and economics, is put in the linear trend. Right? We can include that, and it's about the same. So no matter what way we torture this data, it's about 0.6%. The women, again, are a little bit more mushy. They're not statistically significant, but then they become statistically significant, which is a little wonky. Again, if we just look at the full-time labor-attached women, and then people haven't taken, time off from work, they're fully attached, then the results for women are very similar to men. So this is showing that moving the cutoff date is beneficial in terms of long-term wages. Now, remember back to this discussion about directly affected and indirectly affected kids, right? So if this was coming only from the directly affected kids, this would be a really large point estimate, right? Because it's just 1 month are directly affected. 0.6 would be like 7% increase in wages for every month. That's sort of unreasonable. So what we want to say is, well, clearly something's going on with these indirectly affected kids, or else our point estimates don't really make much sense. Okay? And so something's going on with this cohort age effect. It's not just a biological age effect, some sort of cohort age effect that's going on. So what we do is, this looks messier than it has to be, is basically we're just interacting quarter of birth, so what quarter of the year that you're born in, with all the variables. So this is not ideal because we know that the cutoff date can change month by month and actually can change from like 15th of the month to the beginning of the month. Of course, the census doesn't have month of birth, it only has quarter of birth, which is really problematic. A lot of things don't, when you're trying to do this kind of research, very few things have age and birth dates in it. And so we only have quarter of birth. So it makes it a little bit hard to figure out who the directly affected kids are and who the indirectly affected kids. So you know that most people in the fourth quarter are going to be directly affected overall because that's where most of this action is coming from. Same in the third quarter because the change goes into like what month? September. Right, so the third quarter people sometimes are directly affected. The first quarter people sometimes are a little bit directly affected because if the cutoff date was originally January 1st or December 1st, the wiggle room of people holding their kids back and putting them forward is right around that cutoff. So the only quarter that we know for sure are indirectly affected are the quarter 2 babies. Those guys should not be affected by this entry age law changes at all, other than indirectly by the cohort age effect. Okay? So this is the same equation as before, it just looks messy. We're just interacting all our variables with this quarter of birth. So now we have quarter of birth specific state indicators, we have quarter of birth cohort indicators, and so we're just having a more flexible model. So again, it's hard to find data with birth dates. So the ACS, so the 1980 census had birth dates, quarter of birth, but then they dropped it for 1990, 2000, and now they finally put it back from the 2005 to 2007 ACS. So now we have to restrict our sample just to the 2005, 2007 ACS. Okay? So what we do first is in panel A, we just redo the analysis that we did prior, but use restricted sample to make sure that there's nothing that specific about the 2005, 2007 ACS. Okay? We find slightly higher point estimates, but it's in the ballpark. Women go away. Again, this is a women problem. Women were haunting me. Yes, I know. Everybody had problems with this. And again, this is like the massive table of doom where we did all sorts of permutations of women. And again, if you see the women who are firmly attached, they're back in the sample. I just didn't want to confuse the situation. But then panel B is where we interact this quarter of birth with this S variable, this minimum school entry age law. Okay? So this is going to be the quarter 4 babies. This is quarter 1, quarter 2, and quarter 3. What we see is, which is really interesting, is that quarter 2 babies are not, and quarter 1 actually, are not statistically different than the quarter 4 babies. Meaning that the indirect effect is really powerful. Right? So we're seeing an indirect effect for the quarter 1 and quarter 2 babies. So if it was just an effect of being absolute biologically older, we should see that these are the same statistically as the quarter 4 babies. So what we're finding is that this effect is actually coming from the entire cohort, which is not terribly surprising when you talk to teachers about, kids and disruptions and stuff, it's not terribly surprising that just having an older cohort is beneficial for everybody in the entire cohort. But it's sort of cool. So we don't see, but then the stars mean that jointly it's statistically significant. So this is not, quarter 2 is not statistically significantly different than quarter 4, but jointly they're statistically positive. Okay?
Why is quarter 3 negative?
Quarter 3 is negative. That's actually sort of a little bit of a puzzle. We think it's because those kids are becoming really, really young. So they have a really large relative age effect. And so that's more powerful than the absolute age effect. But that is a little bit of a puzzle. I'm going to put my hands above the table and say we're surprised to see that it was as, it's only marginally statistically significant, but it is there. And it generally stays there. Females generally, oh, this is not my remote, is a little bit messier, but we see overall a little bit of roughly the same patterns. So, what do we find with it? So we find that this minimum school entry age has little impact, or I'm going to say no impact. We find no statistically significant impact on educational attainment.
So, just sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
But that's not consistent with, no, just on that. The attainment null effect, other literature finds negative attainment effect, right? There's work out of Sweden, I don't remember which of the,
No.
right now?
So now we're looking at the policy effect
Okay.
of the cutoff date. So Sandra
They do
Black,
a discontinuity around the cutoff.
Sandra, I think you're talking about Sandra Black's paper with Swedish or Norwegian data or Swedish
Okay.
data, and they find that if you are the oldest, you drop out earlier. Yeah. So again, it's sort of this interesting thing of looking at individual versus the whole cohort. So what we're doing is looking at the whole cohort effect, and not as an individual child, is it beneficial or not? Because some people are going to be winners and losers in this, because if you become relatively young, like you're flipping from old to young, you're going to be a loser, but your classmate's going to be a winner. And so it evens out in that way. But if you're just looking at an individual, then you have winners and losers. But yeah, no, we were very surprised that we didn't find an effect in education. So where this is coming from, it has to be some sort of in-school, in-grade human capital accumulation. People are learning more, they're doing better, and that's translating to the wages. So we find approximately 50% higher wages per month, which, again, I don't know what you guys feel. Some people think it's really big, some people don't think that's big at all. I think it's perfect, of course. But there is, so all this legislature moving these cutoff dates earlier actually is going to have a benefit. Okay? One thing that you can point out, though, is the directly affected kids are, they have to wait to enter the labor market for a year. Right? So they get one less year in the labor market to earn, have earning power. However, though, since the indirectly affected kids do so well with this, that their benefit outweighs the cost for the directly affected kids by changing this. So a big question about this, I think I'm about an hour in, yep, is, let's actually talk about this one, because I sort of upside down here. What is the optimal age? Okay, so I just told you this is great. You know, we're just going to keep moving this cutoff date earlier in the year, and 0.6%. We're going to be like the most amazing country in the world by doing this. Okay, but we only looked from January to the earliest was one, and I think Indiana was August, right? Now states are pushing it, right? We're going earlier and earlier and earlier, and July. There's been discussion in June, and we don't know if that's beneficial still. So again, like I've given them some ammunition saying this is a good thing, but how old do you want your kids to start school? Right? So we don't know. So trying to figure out what the optimal age is going to be really, really difficult. So hopefully for as an economist and as a person that uses data, maybe there's going to be enough switches back and forth that we can sort of see if we're pushing it too early in the year when we look at Junes, Julys. Is that still good? Maybe we're going to hit a point where that's actually negative. And then we can sort of have some sort of idea of the optimal age. Right now, all I can say is, moving in this small range is beneficial in terms of long-run wages. But it's also really important because we don't really know what's driving these relative age effects, right? We don't know what's in this box. This is one thing that always frustrates me with a lot of my work is I don't have the answer. I give you this nice broad statement of what's going on, but I don't know exactly why these maturity differences perpetuate over time. Why does it matter if you're 4.5 versus 5 when you're 18? So what are the mechanisms? So I spend a lot of time trying to look at like ability grouping, because even though we don't have informal ability grouping in the U.S. very much, we have lots of informal ability grouping. Right? So I remember I was in like the red group versus the blue group, and the blue group were the dumb people, and I got to be in the, we got the better readers. And then clearly, because I had the better reader in kindergarten, or I think it was first grade that we got the blue and the red, then the next year I was in the higher group. And the next year I was in the higher group. The problem is, how do you measure that? Right? So if you look at, if you can't get a good measure of this ability grouping, because everybody denies that we ability group. That's one thing in the U.S. We don't ability group, but we always are ability grouping. The other question is this a relative effect, or is this an absolute effect? So Elder and Lobotsky did some work looking at the ECLS, so it's like a survey starting in kindergarten, and they looked at test scores at kindergarten and said, you know what, the kids who are older do better than the kids that are younger at school entry. So the first they're tested, the month they got into school. And they say, well, maybe it just has to do with being older, so being 5.5 versus 5 entering. It has nothing to do with being on the relative scale effect. And it's really, really difficult to disentangle, right? Because your age is associated with your relative age status. So we need to figure out a way to disentangle these two. Elizabeth Cassio at Dartmouth tried this using Project STAR, where they randomly assign kids into kindergarten classes and then first grade. But the problem there is she found that it was all an absolute biological age effect and not a relative age effect. The problem with that was that there are very small differences in relative age. So her experiment was going from the 13th youngest in class to the 12th youngest. Really small. And that we don't think that makes a difference. When we're looking at all our relative age things, it's all oldest versus youngest. It's the real large effects. Yeah?
I'm not sure I understand what's happening in these states or in communities that don't have a state policy, but isn't there a way to take a small number of states and look at first to see whether kindergarten is compulsory or not, whether it's full day or half day, and if parents have a choice not to send their kids to kindergarten, but then to first grade, somehow all of that together must have an effect on those kids who do go into first grade. Also, depending upon the nature of the kindergarten program, which is huge. It goes from play, the kindergarten, which I had, to very intensive, academically oriented kindergarten, which is now replicating what grade 1 used to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we can control for whether or not it's compulsory, when it became subsidized by the state, and whether or not it's half or full day. So we control for that in our stuff. But what kind of kindergarten, we can't. We don't know. But that does matter. That is probably not going to relate, though, to birthdays. So your birthday is sort of a random component, minus the fact that some higher income parents target the summer. So these effects are basically predicated on the fact that your birth date is random versus randomly assigned versus the cutoff date. So within state, so you want to know. I'm trying to think of what exactly you want. It matters, but in this estimation, it's sort of taking that out, that component out. We'd only be worried for this minimum school entry age if those things are changing at the same time as the cutoff date is changing. And they're not in this particular data. But I don't think I answered your question.
I don't know whether you have any information that it tries to show us that would address in even a few places the differences between, as I say, a few states in which you know what the state policy is, whether it's a local option or not, which, for example, in Massachusetts it is, that I know, and then what the nature of the program is that makes all the difference. And then to make SES comparisons, for example, in Boston, I believe, not only is kindergarten an all-day program, but 3-year-olds who are learning disabled have a free program at the age of 3 and 4. If you're not learning disabled, you can't, take advantage of that. You have to.
Yeah, no,
they allow you in altogether, and that I don't know. So that's a huge number of kids right there.
Yeah, in terms of that, it's super interesting. Look at getting data on that kind of stuff is really, really difficult. In this time period, what I'm talking about, this is almost all these kindergartens are half day. It's more homogeneous because we're talking about what I think of kindergarten, my kindergarten was, because we're looking at longer time periods. If we were updating this, again, my great idea for anybody 10 years from now, tell their grad students to do, then I think you'd have to think a little bit more carefully about the other programs.
So the half versus the whole is an important issue because it related to collective bargaining issues years ago. How would you count a kindergarten teacher in with all the other teachers if that teacher wasn't teaching a full day?
Yes.
So, I can't explain all the variables that would be affected, but that is a major.
It definitely affects
right
it. It doesn't
there.
affect this estimation because those things aren't correlated with birth dates. Because birth dates are random. So the only thing that to change the interpretation of what I've done, things have to be correlated with cutoff dates or the birth dates. But there's super important things that nobody's really looking into. Really,
But that's for first grade, not for kindergarten, your cutoff dates. I don't know what the state of affairs is. Are the cutoff dates for kindergarten, if it's compulsory, or not? I don't know. Or when you give a cutoff date, or when you get it off of the, some school sheet, would it necessarily say cutoff date for first grade, regardless of what's happening at the
they
kindergarten?
do. It's very explicit. I didn't run across anyone that had. That's not true. There's Pennsylvania's another. I'm going to say Massachusetts, Pennsylvania are weird states in the cutoff world. Other than that, they have a cutoff date for first and kindergarten. If it's not compulsory, they're the same. They're the same date. At this time period, most people are going to kindergarten, like the kindergarten take-up rate. I did a paper on kindergarten and how kindergarten grew over time, and most people are in kindergarten during this time period, and it's almost all half day.
And following up with what Dr. Sutsky's asking, but if SES and birth date are correlated, high SES does have a higher incidence at a certain time. You have non-compulsory kindergarten. I'm thinking, what are those kids doing during that year they're not attending? If you have kids not attending kindergarten or not attending school, and they're higher SES, they may be getting learning experiences that are going to affect them down the long term.
Right.
And if those kids are more likely to fall into the red shirt category, that could change the impact of it, because SES is getting involved now, if it is correlated with birth
Yeah,
date.
no, it does. It will. And so those are attenuating all my results because I'm lucky in the sense that it's summer and all our cutoff dates are in the fall. So all of this stuff that you're talking about could affect it, but that'd just make my estimates, if we took that out, it'd make the estimates bigger than what I'm finding. Because I'm lucky. This is one of these things where you see the data, you're like, oh, thank goodness it's all in the summer and not, if all the targeting of, if higher income, higher SES women were targeting January, then I'd have a problem. Then everything would be biased upwards. And I couldn't tell you. Now I know everything's biased downwards. And so that all my effects are the lower bound of this other stuff that's going on. This is really important. I did a paper on kindergarten looking at the benefits of kindergarten, looking at the expansion of kindergarten, and found that it only benefited low SES kids because the high SES kids have good alternatives. So all this stuff is very, very important. But in terms of this age stuff, it's not playing into these estimates other than that I have a lower bound of these estimates.
Please correct me if I'm wrong. In one of your previous slides, you show that older students have more opportunity for leadership. And I was wondering if you are equating that to self-confidence, because that was also on the slide, and if providing leadership opportunity to the younger students would equalize the outcome.
It could. I don't know, right? So I know that the older kids self-identified as being more confident and more mature. So this is always the problem with the stuff that I've done is like the policy prescription. I don't know that if giving more leadership experiences to the younger kids would bring them up. I don't know. Ideally, hopefully, yes.
Did that hold across gender?
Yes, it did. Yeah, that was actually surprising. We thought it was going to be a male effect.
I would think so.
We're also in that paper. We're actually controlling for birth weight, like size. So we know your birth weight and and then we know your BMI. So we're controlling for even your size, which is sort of fun because I thought it was going to be just a big male thing, but it wasn't.
It's not a height thing.
Yeah, it's not a height thing because initially I was like, oh, the leadership and the sports is all going to be about being big and guy.
True is fine.
Exactly.
Who talks the most? Girls. Girls are going to be the leaders because they will dutifully follow the directions of the teacher.
They're not though. They're much smaller percentage of leaders.
They are.
Yeah. Appreciate that. Yes.
With girls, when you're talking about having the TIMS data and stuff, did you find an early bloomer negative effect for girls who were held back a year because there have been some research in the past that says girls who are early bloomers have some negative academic consequences?
Oh, so no, because our estimation is only kids that enter and progress on time. Again, this is why I can't speak to holding kids out, which is a really important policy question. It's one of these things I hate. I'm sort of embarrassed to tell you I can't say anything about it. So I suspect that could be going on. We just know that within, if you go into school, you're older versus younger, that makes a difference. But I suspect all that kind of stuff is important, but I can't say anything to it. And it's really hard to get at that, right, because it's all selected. Like, the sample of kids that are held back is selected, and there's a reason why parents are holding it back, and you can't control for the parent characteristics, or we don't have a good way to control to know whether or not they're going to do bad or better. Is it based on their parents and their outcomes, or is it based on being held back? So it's really hard to figure out how to identify that appropriately, because all the literature...
Could you do it as just a discontinuity around the cutoff?
If there's a cutoff for holding, it must stay back.
There's a minimum, if there's a date for entry to school that's with relatively high compliance, then that would be, you'd have a discontinuity around that date.
You do, and that's sort of what we're using, right?
Yeah.
But the issue, though, is if your kid is above that date, so they could go in, but you're choosing to keep them out, you're a different kind of parent than the parents who aren't choosing that.
Right.
And so how do you disentangle the fact that you generally are going to be higher income, more involved with your kids, is sort of what we find. How do we disentangle that effect, that ability effect? It's back to the ability bias. And I'm not sure how you can do that yet. All the stuff about retention and failure is all selected. Like, we don't know if we just we can't just randomly or hold people back. That's what we need. But that's clearly not going to happen. It would be a bad policy for the experiment. Not go through ethics approval.
We have our social promotion in Florida where they have a test score cutoff.
Yes.
Right, and then we have a discontinuity around the test score cutoff.
That actually, I forgot about that. That's actually started, That's much more compelling than most of the work on.
There are a few studies like that.
Yeah.
Will the transition classes fit in if they are there in the school system? They're not there everywhere.
Like,
transition between K and 1. I mean, how would they fit in?
How would they fit in? I'm trying to think of how that would affect. So in those schools, you're probably going to have more kids that are held back. Again, my estimation is just on the people that are going, so I don't know if I can say anything about the differences across that. All really interesting ideas.
All right, well, thank you so much for